History often hides its most dangerous truths in plain sight, and perhaps no event reveals this more clearly than the Second World War. For decades, we've been told a simple explanation that the war erupted because a dictator invaded a neighboring nation in 1939. But that is the ending of the story, not its beginning. The real causes of World War II are deeper, older, and far more unsettling than the pages of most school textbooks ever dare to explore. They stretch across decades of broken promises, silent failures, economic devastation, and the steady collapse of a world order that believed it had secured peace. This is the story of how the world created its own catastrophe long before the shooting ever began. And if you stay with me until the end, you will see World War II not as a sudden explosion of violence, but as a slow-moving disaster that could have been prevented at every step. To understand how the world plunged into its deadliest conflict, we must start with a peace agreement. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919. School lessons often reduce it to a document ending World War I. But in reality, it was a blueprint for the next global conflict. When the treaty was drafted, Europe was exhausted, millions dead, empires destroyed, economies ruined. In that moment of desperation, the victors chose punishment over reconciliation. Germany was forced to accept total blame for the war. Its army was reduced to a fraction. Its land was taken. Its economy was crippled with impossible reparations. But what textbooks rarely emphasize is this. The treaty didn't just weaken a nation, it humiliated it. Humiliation is a powerful fuel, one that burns slowly but fiercely. It plants seeds of resentment, anger, and desperation. It invites the rise of voices promising strength, revenge, and restored pride. Versailles didn't prevent another war. It merely paused it. But humiliation alone is not enough to ignite a global conflict. For that, you need a world incapable of responding to danger. And that world existed in the 1920s and 1930s. After the First World War, nations attempted something noble. A global organization designed to prevent future conflicts, the League of Nations. It had one fatal flaw. It was a power without power. It could recommend, but not enforce. Warn, but not act. Hope, but not command. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned it, and Japan simply ignored the condemnation. When Italy attacked Ethiopia in 1935, the League protested, and nothing changed. Each act of aggression was a test. Each test was failed. And each failure announced to the world, you can break the rules. There will be no consequences. This silent permission encouraged the rise of territorial ambitions across the globe. The world was no longer safe. It was leaderless. But political failure was only half the story. The other half was economic devastation. In 1929, the global economy collapsed. Banks failed. Factories shut down. Millions lost their jobs. But what schools rarely highlight is how this economic collapse shaped politics more than any battlefield. When people are hungry, unemployed, and desperate, they become vulnerable to the loudest voices, the strongest promises. And across the world, new leaders rose by offering simple solutions to impossible problems. Nationalism promised pride. Militarism promised jobs. Authoritarianism promised stability. This wasn't just a German story. It was global. The Depression did not merely weaken economies. It destroyed trust in democracy. And in that vacuum, extremist ideologies took root. By the mid-1930s, the signs of danger were everywhere. Militarization, expansion, aggression, nations openly preparing for war. But the world's major powers were haunted by memories of the First World War. They were determined to avoid another conflict at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing smaller nations. This policy became known as appeasement. Each time aggressors advanced, diplomats negotiated. Each time international laws were broken, leaders expressed concern. Each time a treaty was violated, the world looked away. Appeasement was not cowardice. It was fear. Fear of another catastrophic war. But fear, left unchecked, becomes its own kind of danger. By trying to prevent war, Appeasement made it inevitable. It told aggressive nations, "The world will not stop you. You can take more. Push farther. Demand more." And they did. The interwar period from 1919 to 1939 is often described as a time of peace, but it was a peace filled with fractures. Alliances were weak. Nations pursued their own interests. Global cooperation was an illusion. While schools teach the rise of dictators as a central cause, what they rarely explain is this: dictators do not rise in strong systems. They rise in broken ones. The world after World War I was not stable. It was fragile, and fragile systems do not resist pressure. They collapse. By the late 1930s, the world was no longer drifting toward war. It was marching. The final years before the war were a chain reaction, each event strengthening the next. Nations rebuilt armies at unprecedented speed. Borders were redrawn without consent. Nations signed agreements they never intended to honor. Entire populations were shaped by propaganda to believe war was necessary. These weren't isolated moments. They were the final cracks in a world order already weakened by decades of mistakes. In 1939, when the first shots were fired, the war didn't begin. It was revealed. The collapse that had been building for 20 years had finally reached its breaking point. So why don't schools explain this? The real causes of World War II are complex. They spread across nations, decades, and decisions made in quiet conference rooms rather than on battlefields. Schools simplify history because simplicity is easier to teach. 1939. Poland. Invasion. World War II begins a sentence, a date, a memory for the exam. But this simplicity hides the truth and the warning. World War II did not erupt because one man wanted power. It erupted because the world around him allowed the conditions for that power to grow. And that is why understanding these causes matters today. Look closely at the world around us, and you will see familiar patterns. Global economic instability, rising nationalism, weakening international institutions, superpower competitions, nations testing the limits of international law, border disputes, the return of propaganda. History never repeats itself exactly, but its shadows always return. The true lesson of World War II is not about battles or borders. It is about systems failing, about warnings ignored, about peace taken for granted. World War II was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a long, preventable tragedy made possible by silence, hesitation, economic collapse, and broken diplomacy. Understanding these deeper causes is not simply about knowing history. It is about recognizing the early signs of global instability, signs that still appear today. Because the most important truth schools rarely explain is this: World War II did not start in 1939. It started the moment the world stopped protecting peace. And if we forget this, the echoes of the past will return louder than ever. Thanks for watching, and if you found this perspective valuable, please consider subscribing for more content. The challenge is how we see our history.